When Roger Moore and Tony Curtis first agreed to work together, it looked like the perfect pairing. Two global stars, two completely different worlds forced into the same spotlight. But behind the charm and humor that audiences saw on screen, something far more complicated was unfolding. The tension wasn't loud, and it wasn't always visible, but it was there from the very beginning. And the truth is, the reasons they struggled to connect had less to do with ego and more to do with who they were as people. Two men from completely different worlds. Before they ever stepped onto the same set, Roger Moore and Tony Curtis were already walking two completely different paths in life, shaped by environments that could not have been more opposite. Roger Moore was the embodiment of British refinement. Educated, polished, and deeply influenced by traditional values, he carried himself with a quiet discipline that came from both his upbringing and his early training at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. His career had been built steadily, with roles that emphasized charm, control, and composure, most notably as Simon Templar in The Saint. By the time he entered The Persuaders, he wasn't just an actor, he was also a producer, invested not only in his performance, but in the structure, quality, and reputation of the entire series. Tony Curtis, on the other hand, came from a far harsher reality. Raised in the Bronx in a difficult environment, he had experienced instability from an early age. His childhood was marked by struggle, emotional turbulence, and a constant need to survive rather than simply grow. He carried that energy into adulthood, shaping both his career and his personality. Curtis had already become a major Hollywood star, known for his charisma and intensity, but also for unpredictability. His approach to acting was instinctive rather than disciplined, emotional rather than structured, and often driven by impulse rather than routine. When the two men were brought together for The Persuaders, the contrast was immediate. Moore approached the project with a sense of responsibility, seeing it as something he needed to shape and protect. Curtis, however, saw it differently. For him, television was not the same as film, and stepping into a series format came with hesitation. He was used to the control and prestige of Hollywood productions, and adjusting to a structured television schedule in Europe was not something that came naturally to him. Their working styles began to clash almost instantly. Moore believed in doing the job thoroughly, even if it meant staying longer, refining scenes, or addressing technical issues like post-synchronization. Curtis, however, often resisted anything that extended beyond what he considered necessary. There were reports that he refused to do additional work after filming, forcing Moore to find creative solutions just to maintain production quality. At one point, Moore even negotiated with Curtis to complete technical audio work during lunch breaks, on the condition that luxury food and champagne were provided. This wasn't just about preference, it revealed something deeper. Moore saw acting as a craft that required discipline and commitment beyond the camera. Curtis saw it as a performance that ended when the scene was done. Neither approach was wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible. The set was never as easy as it looked. What made the situation between Roger Moore and Tony Curtis more complicated was that the pressure of The Persuaders was constant and unforgiving. The series was filmed across multiple European countries, with demanding travel schedules and tight production timelines, while also relying heavily on the chemistry between its two leads. Unlike a film where tension could be contained for a few weeks, this was a long-form commitment, and every unresolved difference followed them from one location to another. Moore, who had a stake in the production itself, treated each day as a responsibility. He wasn't just acting, he was thinking about budgets, schedules, and how the final product would be perceived. Every delay mattered to him, every compromise felt like a risk to the integrity of the show. This level of involvement meant he often stayed longer on set, worked through problems, and pushed for solutions even when it required extra effort. Curtis approached the situation very differently. Having built his reputation in Hollywood, he was used to a system where his role was clearly defined. He performed, and others handled the rest. On the Persuaders, that boundary was blurred. He found himself in an environment where expectations extended beyond performance, and that created friction almost immediately. He was known to leave once his scenes were complete, while Moore remained behind, still working. This difference in commitment became visible in specific moments that people on set never forgot. During filming, technical issues often required post-synchronization work, especially when scenes were affected by external noise or inconsistent audio. Moore saw this as essential to maintaining quality. Curtis, however, resisted the idea of returning to work after filming had wrapped for the day. It wasn't something he believed he should have to do. Rather than confronting him directly, Moore adapted. He suggested completing the work during lunch breaks, turning what should have been a routine technical process into a negotiated compromise. Even then, Curtis agreed only under conditions that reflected his own priorities: luxury meals delivered to set, turning a professional necessity into something more personal. It was a small example, but it revealed how differently the two men viewed their roles. There were also deeper tensions that surfaced in less controlled ways. Director Val Guest later recalled that Curtis could be difficult on set, often arriving with complaints about wardrobe or production decisions. These moments disrupted the flow of filming and created an atmosphere where others had to adjust around him. Moore, in contrast, rarely expressed frustration openly. Instead, he managed situations quietly, stepping in when necessary but avoiding escalation. One incident became almost legendary among those who witnessed it. During a tense moment on location, Curtis was criticizing aspects of the production, speaking loudly about how things would have been handled differently in Hollywood. Moore approached him calmly, took him aside, and delivered a sharp but controlled remark that immediately shifted the mood. The tension broke, not through confrontation, but through Moore's ability to diffuse the situation with humor and authority. Still, moments like that did not erase the underlying issue. The problem was not a single disagreement or a temporary clash. It was a constant imbalance in expectations. Moore believed in consistency and discipline. Curtis operated on instinct and personal comfort. Each day required them to meet in the middle, but neither man truly changed his approach. The truth about their relationship: conflict or misunderstanding. As stories from the set began to circulate over the years, a narrative slowly formed around Roger Moore and Tony Curtis that they simply did not like each other. But the reality was far more complicated, and in many ways far more human. The tension between them was not driven by a single explosive feud, but by a series of misunderstandings, personality clashes, and unspoken expectations that never fully aligned. One of the strongest external accounts came from guest star Joan Collins, who described the atmosphere on set as strained during her appearance. She pointed directly to Curtis's temper, suggesting that his behavior created tension that others had to navigate carefully. Director Val Guest later supported that view, recalling how Curtis often arrived with grievances, sometimes influenced by his personal habits at the time, which made consistency difficult during filming. These accounts painted a picture of a set where unpredictability was part of the daily routine. Yet, when Moore and Curtis spoke about each other, their words told a different story. Moore repeatedly insisted that they had a good working relationship, emphasizing that they shared a sense of humor and mutual respect. Curtis, years later, spoke about Moore with genuine affection, even stating that he would never support a remake of The Persuaders without him. These statements were not defensive. They were consistent, and they came long after the pressures of the series had ended. The contradiction between these perspectives reveals something important. The tension was real, but it was not rooted in hatred. It came from the fact that both men were operating from entirely different internal frameworks. Moore believed in professionalism as a form of discipline, something steady and controlled. Curtis approached life with a far more volatile emotional range, shaped by a difficult past and ongoing personal struggles. His behavior on set was not always about the work itself. It was often a reflection of what he was dealing with internally. There were also subtle differences in how each man viewed success and identity. Moore was deeply aware of his public image and carried it with a sense of responsibility. He knew that being the face of a major series meant maintaining a certain standard, both on and off screen. Curtis, however, had already experienced the highs and lows of Hollywood fame. By the time he joined the series, he was not chasing validation in the same way. That difference created an imbalance in motivation that neither of them openly addressed. Even their communication styles worked against them. Moore preferred diplomacy. When problems arose, he handled them quietly, often using humor to diffuse tension rather than confront it directly. Curtis, on the other hand, was more direct, more expressive, and at times more confrontational. Without clear communication, small issues were never fully resolved. They were simply absorbed into the daily rhythm of production. And yet, despite everything, there were moments that revealed a genuine connection beneath the friction. They laughed together. They understood each other's timing on screen in a way that could not be faked. The chemistry that audiences loved was not an illusion. It was built on something real, even if it was complicated. In fact, it may have been their differences that made that chemistry work. Each man pushed against the other, creating a dynamic that felt alive rather than rehearsed. Success that came at the wrong time. By the time The Persuaders was fully completed, the relationship between Roger Moore and Tony Curtis had settled into something functional, but not fully resolved. They had learned how to work together, how to navigate each other's differences, and how to deliver performances that audiences believed in. But just as that fragile balance began to stabilize, something else changed the course of everything. The series itself faced a problem that neither actor could control. Despite strong reception in parts of Europe, it struggled to gain traction in the American market. This was a critical issue because the entire concept of pairing a British star with an American star had been built around securing success in the United States. Tony Curtis had been brought in specifically to attract American audiences, yet the show failed to achieve the level of ratings that had been expected. For Curtis, this outcome carried a different weight than it did for Moore. He had taken a risk by stepping into a television series at a time when film actors still viewed TV as a step down. The lack of success in the U.S. made that decision feel uncertain, even if the show itself was well made. It added another layer of complexity to his experience. He was already adjusting to a different production system, and now the payoff he had been brought in to deliver was not fully materializing. Moore, however, was about to move in an entirely different direction. While The Persuaders was still fresh, he accepted the role that would redefine his career: James Bond. The transition happened quickly, and it effectively closed the door on any possibility of continuing the series. There had been discussions about a second season, even proposals to replace Moore with another actor if necessary, but the unique dynamic between him and Curtis was considered impossible to replicate. Without that balance, the show could not survive. This sudden shift changed how their time together was remembered. What had been a demanding, sometimes difficult collaboration became something finite, almost frozen in time. There was no second season to evolve their relationship, no extended period where differences could soften or deepen. Instead, everything they had built was left exactly where it stood. For Curtis, the end of the series marked a return to a career that would continue to fluctuate. He moved between projects, navigating the challenges that had always followed him, both professionally and personally. For Moore, the transition into Bond brought global recognition, stability, and a level of success that reshaped his public image. The contrast between their trajectories became more visible as the years went on. And yet, despite these diverging paths, neither man framed their time on The Persuaders as a failure. Moore often spoke of the series with pride, recognizing its quality and the unique partnership it had created. Curtis, despite his initial doubts about television, acknowledged the significance of the experience, even if it had not delivered the kind of success he once expected. What they never said, and what remained after. In the years that followed, the story of Roger Moore and Tony Curtis did not end with conflict, as many had assumed. Instead, it slowly revealed something quieter, something that only became clear with time. The distance that once existed between them did not disappear, but it changed shape. Without the pressure of daily filming, without the expectations of production schedules and creative control, their relationship settled into something more honest. Moore would go on to become one of the most recognizable faces in cinema, carrying the role of James Bond through multiple films, even as critics questioned his age. He responded to that criticism with humor, once admitting he was far too old for it, yet continuing to deliver performances that audiences embraced. Off-screen, he became known for something even more enduring, his humanitarian work, particularly with UNICEF, where he dedicated years of his life to helping children in need. That commitment reflected the same qualities he had shown on set: consistency, responsibility, and a quiet sense of purpose. Curtis's path was far less stable. His career moved through highs and lows, shaped not only by changing industry trends, but also by his own internal struggles. He had long battled issues tied to his past: self-esteem, identity, and a tendency toward self-destructive behavior. There were moments when success seemed within reach again, but they were often followed by setbacks. Unlike Moore, whose life gradually moved toward structure, Curtis continued to navigate uncertainty, both professionally and personally. And yet, when they spoke about each other later in life, there was no bitterness. Curtis referred to Moore with warmth, making it clear that whatever difficulties they had experienced did not define their relationship. Moore, in turn, never dismissed Curtis. He acknowledged their differences openly, but never reduced them to conflict. Instead, he described them as two very different men who managed to share something important: a sense of humor, a working rhythm, and an understanding that did not always need to be explained. There were moments that revealed the depth of that connection. Long after the series had ended, Moore remained a presence in Curtis's life. When Curtis faced personal tragedy, Moore was there, offering support not as a co-star, but as a friend. These were not public gestures designed for attention. They were quiet, personal acts that suggested something far stronger than the tension people focused on. So when you look back at Roger Moore and Tony Curtis, do you think their differences made The Persuaders better? Or did it hold them back from something even greater? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.